On the night I tried to celebrate my mother, she looked me in the eye and said the best present would be if I left her life forever. So I did, and what followed was a chain of events she never saw coming. The candlelight flickered across her cold smile as those words shattered everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about myself. She wanted me gone. Fine. But she had no idea that her wish would transform me from the broken daughter she'd molded into someone who would expose every ugly truth she'd spent decades hiding behind her perfect facade. My name is Emily Monroe, and I used to believe that love could conquer anything, even a mother who saw me as her greatest disappointment. The reservation at Lumiere was for 7:30 p.m., but I arrived 20 minutes early, my hands trembling as I clutched the small velvet box containing the pearl earrings I'd saved 3 months to buy. The restaurant buzzed with Cleveland's elite, crystal glasses catching the warm glow of chandeliers, the kind of place Mother had always said I'd never be sophisticated enough to appreciate. Tonight, I was determined to prove her wrong. I'd spent weeks planning this birthday celebration for her 55th, calling ahead to ensure they had her favorite wine, a $200 bottle of Bordeaux that would eat into my grocery budget for the next month. As a 32-year-old editor at Hartwell Press, my salary was decent but not extravagant. Still, nothing was too expensive if it meant one perfect evening with Margaret Monroe, the woman who had spent my entire life reminding me I wasn't quite enough. She swept in at exactly 7:30, never one to be early or late, her silver hair styled in that impeccable bob that never seemed to move, even in Cleveland's unpredictable lake-effect winds. Her Chanel suit was navy blue power blue. She called it, and her smile was the practiced one she reserved for public spaces, all teeth and no warmth. "Darling," she said, air kissing my cheek while scanning the room to see who might be watching. "You look better than usual, though that dress is a bit young for you, don't you think?" The words hit their mark, as they always did, but I forced my smile to stay bright. "Happy birthday, Mom. You look absolutely stunning." We were seated at a corner table I'd specifically requested intimate but visible enough for her to feel important. The waiter appeared immediately, recognizing the Monroe name from the reservation. Mother ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, settling on the salmon for herself and the chicken for me because it's lighter, dear, and you've been looking a bit heavy lately. Through the appetizer course, I listened to her complaints about the country club's new landscaping, her frustration with her book club's choice of lowbrow fiction, and her disappointment in her friend Eleanor's daughter, who had thrown away her potential by becoming a teacher instead of a lawyer. Every conversation with Mother was a minefield, and I navigated carefully, nodding at the right moments, asking the questions she wanted to hear. When the main course arrived, I finally gathered the courage to present the velvet box. "I have something for you." She opened it with the same expression she might wear when examining a questionable piece of fruit at the grocery store. The pearls were beautiful, not expensive enough to be ostentatious, but elegant and classic in a way I thought she'd appreciate. "They're nice," she said, setting the box aside without trying them on. "Though I already have several pairs of pearls. I suppose you can return them if you kept the receipt." The familiar sting of rejection settled in my chest, but I pressed on. I hoped maybe we could start fresh. "Mom, I know things between us have been difficult." Difficult. She set down her wine glass with more force than necessary. "Is that what you call it when your daughter consistently fails to live up to even the most basic expectations when she chooses a career in editing? For heaven's sake, instead of something respectable." "I love my work." "Love doesn't pay the bills or earn respect in society. Look at you, 32 years old, unmarried, living in that cramped apartment, working for some small publishing house no one's ever heard of. Do you know what Eleanor's daughter makes as a corporate lawyer?" The restaurant's ambient noise faded as my world narrowed to the space between us. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be the night we finally connected, the night she saw me as worthy of her love instead of her constant criticism. "I thought maybe, for your birthday, We could focus on the good things, I said quietly. Mother laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Good things. What good things? You've been nothing but a source of embarrassment since the day you were born. Do you know what I tell people when they ask about you? I change the subject. Because what is there to say? The candle between us flickered, casting dancing shadows across her face as she leaned forward. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but every word cut like a blade. Shh, you want to know what would make this the perfect birthday, the best gift you could possibly give me? She paused, her eyes glittering with something I'd never seen before, not just disappointment or frustration, but pure, cold hatred. If you just disappeared from my life entirely, if I never had to see your face or hear your voice or be reminded that I somehow produced such a complete and utter failure. The world stopped. The conversations around us became meaningless noise. The warm restaurant air felt suddenly arctic against my skin. I stared at this woman who had given me life, who had fed me and clothed me and sent me to good schools, and realized with crystalline clarity that she had never, not once, actually loved me. "Well," she said, picking up her fork as if she'd just commented on the weather. "Are you going to eat your chicken? It's getting cold." I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. My voice, when it came, was barely audible. "Happy birthday, Mother." I walked out of Lumiere into the November cold, leaving behind the pearl earrings, the expensive dinner, and 32 years of desperate hope that I could somehow earn Margaret Monroe's love. By the time I reached my car, a plan was already forming in my mind, not the hysterical, emotional reaction she would expect, but something calculated and final. She wanted me to disappear from her life. Fine, I would disappear so completely that she'd never find me again. But first, I was going to make sure she understood exactly what she'd lost. The drive home from Lumiere took me through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, past the perfectly manicured lawns and colonial houses that had been my prison for 18 years. Our housemother's house still stood at the end of Maple Grove Lane, its white pillars gleaming under the streetlights like tombstones marking the death of my childhood dreams. I remember being 7 years old, standing in our marble foyer in my pink tutu, tears streaming down my face because I'd stumbled during ballet recital. While other mothers hugged their daughters and praised their effort, Margaret Monroe knelt down and whispered, "If you can't do something perfectly, why do it at all?" Then she'd made me practice the routine 20 more times before bed, my small feet bleeding in the satin slippers she insisted I wear despite them being a size too small. "Appearance is everything," she'd say while yanking a brush through my tangled hair each morning. "People judge you in the first 3 seconds. You will not embarrass this family." The Monroe family portrait still hung in the living room, father in his navy suit, mother in pearls and that practiced smile, and me at 16, hollow-eyed and rail-thin from the diet she'd put me on because the camera adds 10 pounds, and we can't have you looking chubby. Thomas Monroe stood behind us like a shadow, successful in finance but utterly powerless in his own home. He'd learned long ago that contradicting his wife only made things worse for everyone, especially me. Every achievement in my life had been measured against impossible standards. When I won second place in the statewide writing competition my junior year of high school, beating out hundreds of other students, Mother's only comment was, "Second place is just the first loser. What did the winner do that you didn't?" I'd spent that night crying into my pillow, clutching the silver medal that should have been a moment of pride. The next morning, she'd thrown the local newspaper featuring my photo and story into the trash without reading it. "Don't let it go to your head," she'd said. "One little contest doesn't make you a writer." But it was the piano that broke something fundamental between us. I'd practiced Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major for months, my fingers cramping from the endless repetition she demanded. The piece was beyond my skill level. But Mother had entered me in the regional competition anyway, telling everyone at the country club that her daughter would obviously take first place. When I finished my performance, I knew I'd played well, not perfectly, but with passion and soul. The audience applauded warmly, and for a moment, I felt something I'd rarely experienced: pride in my own accomplishment. I placed third in any other family. This might have been cause for celebration. A bronze medal in a regional competition was nothing to scoff at, especially for a 15-year-old competing against players who'd had private lessons since they could walk. Mother's face during the award ceremony was carved from ice. She smiled for the cameras, accepted congratulations from other parents, but I could see the fury building behind her eyes like a gathering storm. The ride home was silent except for the clicking of her nails against the steering wheel, a sound that still makes my stomach clench with anxiety. When we pulled into our driveway, she finally spoke. "Get out!" Inside the house, she made me sit at the piano bench while she stood behind me, her hands gripping my shoulders so tightly I could feel bruises forming. "Play it again," she commanded. "Mom, I'm tired." "Play it again." I played the nocturne 7 more times that night, each repetition worse than the last as my exhaustion mounted. She criticized every note, every pause, every breath I took. "This is what happens when you don't practice hard enough," she said finally. "This is what happens when you think good enough is actually good enough. You humiliated yourself today, and by extension, you humiliated me." At 2:30 in the morning, she finally let me go to bed. I never played piano again. The pattern repeated itself through high school honor roll wasn't valedictorian. Valedictorian wasn't summa cum laude. Summa cum laude wasn't Harvard. When I chose the University of Chicago for my English literature degree, she spent the entire summer before freshman year listing all the ways I'd already failed at life. "English literature," she'd sneer. "What exactly does one do with English literature? Become a barista with expensive taste in books?" College was supposed to be my escape, but even 200 miles away in Chicago, her influence followed me like a shadow. She called every Sunday at exactly 4 p.m., not to ask how I was doing, but to remind me of my shortcomings and compare me unfavorably to the children of her friends. "Eleanor's daughter just made partner at her law firm," she'd say. "Patricia's son is already a resident at Johns Hopkins. And what did you do this week? Write another paper about dead poets." I tried to build walls around myself, to find strength in my professor's praise and my classmates' friendship, but Mother's voice was always there, drowning out any positive feedback with her relentless criticism. After graduation, when I landed the job at Hartwell Press, I thought I'd finally found something she couldn't diminish. Editing was respectable, intellectual, a career that required skill and knowledge. I was good at it, better than good. I had an eye for narrative structure, a gift for helping authors find their voice. But Mother saw only failure. "A publishing house no one's heard of," she'd tell anyone who asked. "It's not Random House or Simon & Schuster, so really, what's the point?" The worst part wasn't even the criticism, it was the hope that kept me coming back. The little girl inside me who still believed that if I could just achieve enough, work hard enough, be perfect enough, she might finally say she was proud of me. That hope had carried me into Lumiere tonight, clutching those pearl earrings like a peace offering to a God who would never be satisfied. Now, sitting in my car outside my apartment building, I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face for 32 years. Margaret Monroe didn't want a daughter. She wanted a trophy, a reflection of her own perfection, and since I would never be that, I would never be anything to her but a disappointment. The realization was both devastating and liberating. If I was already dead to her, then I had nothing left to lose by actually disappearing. And this time, I wouldn't be running away. I'd be running towards something better. The University of Chicago had been my first taste of freedom. Those 4 years from 18 to 22 when I thought distance might finally silence Mother's voice in my head. I was wrong. My dorm room phone rang every Sunday at exactly 4 p.m., as reliable as a church bell calling the faithful to worship. Except this was a different kind of worship, the kind where I knelt at the altar of Margaret Monroe's disappointment and begged for absolution that never came. How are your grades?" she'd ask, never bothering with pleasantries like, "How are you?" or "Are you happy?" "I have a 3.8 GPA, I'd say, proud, despite myself. Not a 4.0. "What happened? Are you partying too much? I knew sending you so far away was a mistake. You don't have the discipline to succeed without supervision." The conversations always followed the same script. She'd ask about my classes, then dismiss them as impractical. She'd inquire about my professors, then suggest they were probably mediocre since they weren't teaching at Harvard or Yale. She'd demand to know about my social life, then criticize whatever friends I mentioned as distractions from your studies, or not the caliber of people you should associate with. During my sophomore year, I made the dean's list and was invited to join the English Honor Society. When I called to share the news, her response was a sigh of exasperation. "Emily, when are you going to realize that being a big fish in a small pond isn't an accomplishment? These little academic societies don't mean anything in the real world. Eleanor's daughter just got into Harvard Law. Now that's an achievement worth mentioning." I stopped calling with good news after that. My junior year, I fell in love, or what I thought was love, with a boy named Marcus from my Victorian literature seminar. He was brilliant and kind, with dark hair that fell into his eyes when he read poetry aloud. For 6 months, I experienced what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than who I failed to be. I made the mistake of mentioning him during one of Mother's Sunday interrogations. "What does his father do?" she asked immediately. "He's a high school teacher," I said, already sensing danger. "And his mother?" "She's a nurse." The silence stretched for so long I thought the line had gone dead. "Emily," she said finally, her voice dripping with disdain, "I didn't sacrifice to send you to a prestigious university so you could date the son of a teacher and a nurse. You're there to make connections that will elevate your station in life, not drag it down to the level of middle-class mediocrity." She spent the rest of the call detailing all the ways Marcus would hold me back, how his limited background would prevent me from achieving anything meaningful, how I was settling for someone beneath my potential. By the time I hung up, her poison had already started working. I began noticing things about Marcus that hadn't bothered me before: his thrift store clothes, his scholarship student status, the way he worked weekends at the campus bookstore to help pay his tuition. Mother's voice whispered in my ear that I was embarrassing myself, that people were probably talking about how the Monroe girl had lowered her standards. I broke up with Marcus 2 weeks later, using some cruel excuse about needing to focus on my studies. The hurt in his eyes haunted me for months, but Mother's approval when I mentioned I was no longer distracted by inappropriate relationships felt like a drug I couldn't resist. Senior year brought the crushing pressure of choosing a career path. I'd been accepted to several graduate programs in English literature, but Mother had other ideas. "Law school," she announced during one of our calls. "I've spoken to several colleagues, and they all agree that with your grades, you could get into a top-tier program. Corporate law is very lucrative, and it would position you well for marriage to the right sort of man." "I don't want to be a lawyer," I said quietly. "Well, what you want is irrelevant. What matters is what's practical, what's respectable, what will ensure you don't end up dependent on anyone." But I was already dependent on her approval, her financial support, her definition of success. She held my future in her perfectly manicured hands, and we both knew it. The compromise came in the form of Hartwell Press. After graduation, I'd moved back to Cleveland temporarily while job hunting, living in my childhood bedroom with its pink wallpaper and shelves full of books I'd loved before learning they were impractical. When the editorial position opened up, it seemed like a miracle, a job in literature that paid enough to support myself and might even earn a grudging nod of approval from Mother. I was wrong on that last count. "A publishing house," she'd said when I told her about the offer. "Well, I suppose it's better than waitressing, though not by much. Don't expect this to lead anywhere significant. The publishing industry is dying, you know." For 5 years, I'd worked at Hartwell Press, slowly building my reputation as a careful, insightful editor. I loved the work helping authors find their voice, shepherding manuscripts from rough drafts to polished novels, discovering new talent in the slush pile. It was exactly the kind of career I'd dreamed of during those long Chicago nights when I'd read until my eyes burned. But every small success was diminished by Mother's relentless criticism. When I helped edit a novel that made the bestseller list, she pointed out that it wasn't the #1 spot. When I received a promotion to senior editor, she reminded me that the salary was still embarrassingly modest compared to what her friends' children were earning in law and medicine. I'd moved into my own apartment in Cleveland's historic district, a cozy space with exposed brick walls and tall windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. I'd furnished it carefully with pieces I loved: vintage bookshelves, a writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother, soft throw rugs that made the hardwood floors feel warm underfoot. Mother hated it. "It's so small," she'd say during her infrequent visits, running her finger along surfaces to check for dust. "And this neighborhood is questionable. You should have invested in something in the suburbs, something with proper resale value." She criticized everything: my furniture, my decorating choices, my decision to adopt a rescue cat named Fitzgerald. The cat, she declared, was unsanitary and would limit your dating prospects because men don't want to compete with pets for attention. The dating prospects she mentioned were another source of constant friction. At 32, I was practically a spinster in her eyes, my single status a personal failing that reflected poorly on her parenting. She'd ambush me with blind dates, sons of her country club friends, usually lawyers or doctors who treated dinner conversation like depositions or medical consultations. "You're too picky," she'd say after each failed setup. "No one is perfect, Emily. You need to lower your standards if you ever want to find a husband." The irony was devastating. I'd spent my entire life trying to meet her impossibly high standards, only to be told I should lower mine when it came to finding love. 3 months before the disastrous birthday dinner, I'd started seeing someone: a kind, funny journalist named David who wrote for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. He was everything Mother would disapprove of divorced, 4 years younger than me, and passionate about social justice reporting that barely paid his bills. I never told her about him. For the first time in my adult life, I had something that was entirely mine, unmarked by her criticism or disappointment. David and I would spend weekends exploring Cleveland's art galleries and independent bookstores, having long conversations about literature and politics, making love in my sun-drenched apartment while Fitzgerald purred contentedly on the windowsill. It was the happiest I'd ever been, which should have been a warning. Happiness, in the Monroe family, was always temporary, always followed by a reckoning. The night I sat in that restaurant watching my mother destroy me with such casual cruelty, I realized that I'd been living half a life constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for her approval that would never come, measuring every decision against her impossible standards. David deserved better than a girlfriend who was terrified to introduce him to her family. Hartwell Press deserved an editor who could celebrate her successes without immediately cataloging how they fell short of perfection. And I deserved a life that belonged entirely to me. As I sat in my car outside my apartment building, staring up at the warm light spilling from my living room windows, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to disappear from Margaret Monroe's life so completely that she'd never find me again. But this time, I wouldn't be running away from something. I'd be running toward the person I was meant to be, the person who'd been suffocating under the weight of her expectations for 32 years. It was time to find out who Emily Monroe really was when she stopped trying to be what her mother wanted. The planning took 3 weeks, each day methodical and deliberate in a way that would have made Mother proud if she'd known what I was plotting. I moved through my regular routines editing manuscripts at Hartwell Press, having dinner with David, feeding Fitzgerald while secretly dismantling the life of Emily Monroe piece by piece. The hardest part was lying to David. He sensed something was wrong during our last dinner together at our favorite Italian restaurant on Coventry Road. I'd been quiet, distracted, memorizing the way he laughed at his own terrible jokes, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he touched my hand across the table. "You seem a million miles away," he said, concern creasing his forehead. "Everything okay at work?" I wanted to tell him everything about Mother's birthday dinner, about my plan to disappear, about how much these past months with him had meant to me. Instead, I smiled and said I was just tired, that I'd been working too many late nights. He walked me to my car afterward, kissing me goodbye under the streetlight. "I love you," he whispered against my lips, and I nearly broke, nearly abandoned everything to stay in this moment forever. "I love you too," I whispered back, knowing it would be the last time I'd ever say those words to him. At home, I sat down with a legal pad and mapped out my disappearance like a military operation. First, finances. I had $47,000 in savings, modest but enough to start over if I was careful. I opened a new bank account under the name Rachel Carter, an identity I'd chosen because it was common enough to blend in, different enough from Emily Monroe to feel like a rebirth. Getting the fake identification was easier than I'd expected. A coworker at Hartwell Press had mentioned, during a conversation about identity theft, how simple it was to create new documents if you knew where to look. I spent hours researching online, following digital breadcrumbs until I found what I needed: $500 and 10 days later. Rachel Carter had a social security number, a driver's license, and a birth certificate that said she was born in Toledo, Ohio. I sold my furniture through Craigslist, telling buyers I was moving overseas for work. Each piece that disappeared from my apartment felt like shedding skin the vintage bookshelf where I'd displayed my college literature textbooks, the writing desk where I'd edited countless manuscripts, the antique mirror that had reflected 32 years of trying to see myself through Mother's eyes. Fitzgerald was the worst. I couldn't take him with me. A cat would make it too easy to track me, too difficult to move quickly if I needed to run again. I found him a home with my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd always cooed over him when we met in the hallway. She promised to spoil him with treats and sunny windowsills, and I believed her, but walking away from his confused mewing nearly broke my resolve. At Hartwell Press, I submitted my resignation with 2 weeks' notice, citing family obligations out of state. My boss, Linda Kowalski, was disappointed but understanding. She'd always been kind to me, one of the few people who'd seen my work for what it was rather than what it lacked. "You're one of our best editors," she said, shaking my hand on my last day. "If you ever want to come back, we'll find a place for you." I thanked her, knowing I'd never see her again. The phone call to Mother was surgical in its brevity. I dialed her number at 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, knowing she'd be at her weekly tennis lesson and I'd get her voicemail. "Mother, it's Emily. I wanted you to know that I've taken your advice from my birthday dinner. I'm leaving Cleveland and won't be in touch anymore. I hope this makes you as happy as you said it would." I hung up before my voice could crack. David was harder. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, couldn't trust myself not to confess everything and beg him to come with me. Instead, I left a letter in his mailbox, cowardly and final. "David," I wrote, "I have to leave Cleveland for family reasons I can't explain. Please don't try to find me. What we had was beautiful, and I want to remember it that way. I hope you find someone who can love you the way you deserve. Emily." It was inadequate and cruel, but it was all I could manage without revealing the truth that would make him worry, make him search, make him a potential bridge back to the life I was trying to escape. On November 20th, 3 weeks after Mother's birthday, I loaded everything I was keeping into my Honda Civic 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of books I couldn't live without, my laptop, and a manila envelope containing Rachel Carter's new identity. I'd chosen Denver as my destination almost randomly, picking a city large enough to disappear in but far enough from Cleveland that I wouldn't constantly look over my shoulder for familiar faces. The drive west felt like traveling through time, each mile taking me further from the person I'd been. I stopped for gas in Iowa and threw Emily Monroe's driver's license in a truck stop dumpster, watching 32 years of identity disappear beneath greasy fast food wrappers and discarded coffee cups. When I finally saw Denver's skyline rising from the plains like a mirage, it was past midnight and I was exhausted, running on gas station coffee and adrenaline. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, paying cash and signing the register as Rachel Carter for the first time. The room was barely larger than a closet, with thin walls and a heater that clanked like a dying engine. But as I lay on the scratchy comforter, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the absence of dread. For the first time since childhood, I wasn't waiting for criticism, wasn't bracing for disappointment, wasn't measuring myself against impossible standards. I was nobody, which somehow felt like the first step toward becoming somebody real. The next morning, I bought a prepaid phone and started looking for work. Within a week, I was waitressing at Murphy's Diner, a family-owned restaurant in a working-class neighborhood where nobody asked too many questions about where you came from or why you needed a job that paid under the table. The work was harder than anything I'd ever done 10-hour shifts on my feet, dealing with demanding customers, learning to balance 6 plates on my arms while remembering complicated orders. My first week, I went home every night with aching feet and tears of exhaustion. But nobody criticized my performance. Nobody compared me to other waitresses or listed all the ways I was failing to meet expectations. When I mixed up an order or dropped a glass, my manager, Jorge, would just shrug and say, "It happens. Clean it up and keep moving." The acceptance was revolutionary. My apartment was a studio in a converted warehouse, with pipes visible in the ceiling and windows that faced a brick wall. It was smaller than my walk-in closet had been in Cleveland, furnished with second-hand furniture from thrift stores and yard sales. But it was mine in a way the Cleveland apartment had never been free from Mother's criticism, unmarked by her disapproval. Some nights, lying on my used mattress listening to the couple upstairs argue about money, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. I missed David's laugh, missed the intellectual stimulation of editing, missed Fitzgerald's purring weight on my chest while I read. But I didn't miss the constant anxiety, the voice in my head cataloging my failures, the exhausting effort of trying to be perfect enough to earn love that would never come. Rachel Carter might be poor and lonely and scared, but she was free. And freedom, I was learning, was worth any price. 6 months into my life as Rachel Carter, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about Mother's voice. The silence in my head was so profound it startled me, like suddenly noticing the absence of a persistent headache you'd grown accustomed to living with. Murphy's Diner had become my unlikely sanctuary. The regulars knew me as the quiet girl who never mixed up their orders and always refilled their coffee without being asked. There was Tom, the construction worker who came in every morning at 6:30 for black coffee and wheat toast. Maria, the night shift nurse who stopped by for pie and decaf at 11 p.m., and elderly Mr. Kowalski, who reminded me painfully of my boss at Hartwell Press, though he was infinitely kinder. Jorge, my manager, had quickly recognized that I was overqualified for waitressing my vocabulary, and the way I instinctively corrected grammar on the daily specials board gave me away. But he never pried, never asked questions that might force me to construct elaborate lies. In the restaurant industry, people understood that everyone was running from something. "You're good with people," he told me one afternoon as I helped him count receipts. "Patient. That's rare in this business." The patience had come from years of walking on eggshells around Mother, but I didn't tell him that. Instead, I just smiled and continued stacking 1s and 5s into neat piles. It was Maria, the night shift nurse, who first suggested I might want to talk to someone about whatever I was running from. She'd noticed, she said, how I sometimes got a distant look in my eyes, how I unconsciously touched my phone as if expecting it to ring with bad news. "There's a therapist I know," she said one evening, sliding a business card across the counter with her pie plate. "Dr. Sarah Kellerman. She's good with people who've had difficult families." I stared at the card for a week before calling. The idea of talking to a stranger about Mother, about my pathetic escape, about the mess I'd made of my life, felt impossible. But the silence in my apartment on Sunday afternoons was becoming unbearable, and I was tired of having conversations only with myself. "Dr. Kellerman's office was nothing like I'd expected. No leather couch or intimidating diplomas. Just 2 comfortable chairs and a window that looked out onto a small garden. She was younger than I'd imagined, maybe 40, with graying hair and the kind of calm presence that made you want to tell her secrets. "What brings you here?" "Rachel," she asked during our first session. The name still felt foreign in my mouth, but I was getting used to the way it sounded lighter somehow than Emily, less weighted with expectations. "I left my old life," I said carefully. "My family. It wasn't healthy." She nodded as if people disappeared from their families every day, as if my choice was reasonable rather than dramatic. "Tell me about that," she said simply. And somehow, I did. Not everything at first. I couldn't reveal that Rachel Carter was a fabrication, that I was technically living under a false identity. But I told her about Mother's constant criticism, about growing up feeling like a disappointment, about the birthday dinner that had finally broken something essential inside me. "It sounds like you were raised by someone with narcissistic tendencies," Dr. Kellerman said after several sessions. "Children of narcissistic parents often struggle with perfectionism, self-worth, and the belief that love must be earned through achievement." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if Mother's behavior was a recognizable pattern rather than proof of my fundamental unworthiness. The relief was staggering. "You mean it wasn't my fault?" I asked, feeling foolish for needing the validation. "A child is never responsible for a parent's emotional abuse," she said firmly. "Your mother's inability to show you love wasn't about your worth as a person. It was about her own limitations." Those words echoed in my head for days afterward, reshaping decades of self-doubt into something that felt almost like hope. Around the same time I started therapy, I discovered the Paper Trail, a used bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant 6 blocks from my apartment. The owner, Grace Holloway, was everything Mother would have dismissed as common: a 70-year-old woman with wild silver hair, paint-stained fingers, and a tendency to recommend books based on what she sensed you needed rather than what you asked for. "You look like someone who appreciates Virginia Woolf," she said the first time I browsed her fiction section, pressing a worn copy of To the Lighthouse into my hands. "But this might serve you better right now." She was right. Woolf's exploration of family dynamics and the weight of memory felt like reading my own thoughts written by someone far more eloquent. Grace offered me a part-time job after my 3rd visit, claiming she needed help organizing her chaotic inventory system. The pay was minimal, but being surrounded by books again felt like coming home. More importantly, Grace treated me with a casual kindness I'd never experienced, praising my organizational skills without making them feel like the bare minimum, asking my opinion on book displays as if my thoughts mattered. You have good instincts," she said one afternoon as we arranged a new mystery section. "Ever think about writing yourself?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't written anything creative since college, hadn't even journaled since those painful Sunday phone calls with Mother. But that night, I bought a notebook from the convenience store and started writing not about my current life, but about Emily Monroe, about the girl who'd tried so hard to be perfect that she'd nearly disappeared entirely. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush that kept me up until 3 a.m., my hand cramping as I tried to capture 32 years of suffocation on paper. I wrote about ballet recitals and piano competitions, about birthday dinners that felt like trials, about the exhausting effort of trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. Writing became my new addiction. After my shifts at Murphy's, after my hours at the Paper Trail, I'd sit at my small kitchen table and pour Emily's story onto page after page. It was therapy without the hourly rate, excavation without the fear of judgment. Dr. Kellerman noticed the change in me immediately. "You seem different," she said during our session in early May. "Lighter somehow." "I've been writing," I admitted, "about my family, about growing up. It helps." "Writing can be incredibly healing," she agreed. "It allows us to process experiences, to see patterns we might miss otherwise. What have you discovered about yourself through writing?" The answer surprised me with its clarity. That I'm not actually the person my mother said I was. I'm not a failure or a disappointment. I was just a child trying to love someone who couldn't love me back. That weekend, I walked through Denver's arts district and impulsively bought a used camera from a pawn shop, a Canon that had seen better days but still captured light beautifully. I'd always been drawn to photography but had never pursued it seriously. Another dream deferred by mother's insistence on practical pursuits. Now, with no one to answer to but myself, I started exploring the city through my viewfinder. I photographed empty diners at dawn, elderly men feeding pigeons in Washington Park, the play of shadows on brick walls in forgotten alleys. The camera became my third eye, showing me beauty in places mother would have dismissed as unsavory or beneath notice. For the first time in my life, I was creating something purely for the joy of it, without thought of criticism or comparison. Each photograph was mine alone, no one to judge whether it was good enough, significant enough, worthy enough. Grace displayed some of my photos in the paper trail's window, claiming they captured the soul of the city. Customers began asking about them, and I felt a flutter of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. One evening in late May, as I walked home from the bookstore with camera in hand, I realized something that stopped me in the middle of the sidewalk. I was happy, not the desperate, fragile happiness I'd felt in Cleveland when things were going well, always shadowed by the fear that mother would find something wrong with it. This was different, solid, mine. Rachel Carter might be a fabrication, but the person I was becoming felt more real than Emily Monroe had ever been. I was 28 years old, or rather, I'd created an identity that said I was 28, young enough to start over, old enough to know what I wanted this new life to look like. And for the first time since childhood, I was excited to find out who I might become. The man walked into Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, when the lunch rush had died down and I was wiping tables in the empty back section. He was unremarkable medium height, brown hair, wearing a wrinkled suit that suggested he'd been traveling. But something about the way he scanned the room, his eyes lingering on each waitress's face, made my stomach clench with primitive fear. He sat in my section, ordered coffee and apple pie, and watched me with the kind of attention that felt like being studied under a microscope. When I brought his order, he smiled a practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Excuse me," he said as I set down his coffee cup. "I'm looking for someone. Emily Monroe, about your height, brown hair, would be 32 now. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" My hand stayed steady as I poured his coffee, but inside, my world tilted sideways. She'd found me. After 8 months of silence, 8 months of building Rachel Carter from nothing, mother had tracked me down. "Sorry," I said, keeping my voice level. "Name doesn't ring a bell. Cleveland's a big city, though lots of people passing through." I deliberately mentioned Cleveland instead of correcting him about Denver, hoping to throw him off the scent. His eyes sharpened slightly, like a hunter catching wind of prey. "Actually, I heard she might have come to Denver," he said, pulling out his phone. "This is her—" The photo was from my Hartwell Press ID, professional and polished Emily Monroe in her carefully constructed life. Looking at it felt like staring at a ghost. "Nope, never seen her," I said with what I hoped was convincing indifference. "Hope you find who you're looking for, though." He left a 20 for a $7 bill and walked out without touching his pie. I spent the rest of my shift in a state of controlled panic, jumping every time the door chime rang, watching every car that passed the window. Jorge noticed my distraction and sent me home early, concern creasing his weathered face. "You okay, mija? You look like you've seen a ghost." If only he knew. That night, I called Dr. Kellerman's emergency line, something I'd never done before. She agreed to see me first thing the next morning, and I spent the sleepless hours until then packing everything I owned into 2 suitcases, just like I had in Cleveland. She found me, I told Dr. Kellerman, sitting in her familiar office chair but feeling like I was floating somewhere outside my body. My mother hired someone to find me. "How do you feel about that?" she asked gently.
Terrified.
I admitted. "I thought I was safe. I thought I could just disappear."
What do you want to do?
The question hung in the air between us. What did I want to keep running forever? To hide until I was too old and tired to remember why I'd started running in the first place?
I want to disappear again, I said finally. But further this time. Somewhere she'll never think to look.
Dr. Kellerman nodded thoughtfully.
Before you make that decision, I want you to consider something. Running solved your immediate problem. It got you away from an abusive situation and gave you space to heal, but it also keeps you trapped in a reactive pattern. You're still letting your mother control your life, just from a distance.
Her words stung because they were true. Even 800 miles away, Mother was still dictating my choices, still making me live in fear.
But I wasn't ready to stop running.
Not yet. I gave Jorge notice that same afternoon, claiming a family emergency out of state. He hugged me goodbye and pressed an envelope into my hands, my final paycheck, plus an extra $200.
For whatever trouble you're running from,
he said quietly.
Everyone deserves a chance to start over.
Grace took the news harder. Over the past months, she'd become something like the mother I'd always wished for, encouraging without being demanding, proud of my small accomplishments without making them feel insufficient. "Seattle's calling to me," I told her, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd been researching cities where Rachel Carter could disappear more completely, and Seattle's size and transient population seemed promising.
"You're running from something," she said, not making it a question. "I've seen that look before. Just promise me you won't stop creating. Your photographs, your writing, they matter. Don't let whoever hurt you take that away, too."
She gave me a going-away gift, a leather-bound journal, and a book of Annie Leibovitz photographs. "For when you're ready to tell your story properly," she said. The drive to Seattle took me through the most beautiful landscape I'd ever seen, mountain passes where snow still clung to the peaks despite the summer heat. Forests so dense they seemed to swallow the road entirely. With each mile, I felt the investigator's presence falling away, but also something else, the life I'd been building as Rachel Carter, the first genuine happiness I'd known in years. I cried somewhere outside of Bozeman, Montana, pulling over at a rest stop to sob into my steering wheel. I was giving up Murphy's Diner and Jorge's paternal kindness. I was leaving behind Dr. Kellerman just when therapy was starting to work. I was abandoning Grace and the paper trail, the first place I'd felt valued for who I was rather than who I wasn't. All because Mother couldn't let me go, couldn't accept that I'd rather disappear entirely than continue being her perpetual disappointment. Seattle welcomed me with gray skies and the smell of rain-soaked concrete. I found a furnished studio apartment in Capitol Hill, paid 3 months' rent up front in cash, and started over again. This time, I was more careful. No consistent work schedule, no therapy appointments that could be traced, no close friendships that might lead investigators back to me. But I also couldn't stop creating. Grace's words echoed in my head as I explored Seattle with my camera, capturing the city's moody beauty through my lens. The photographs I took were different from my Denver work, darker, more introspective, full of shadows and hidden corners that seemed to mirror my own psychological landscape. I started showing my work at coffee shops and small galleries, using the name R. Carter to maintain some distance from the Rachel identity. To my amazement, people responded to the photos with genuine enthusiasm. A local gallery owner, Marcus Williams, approached me about a potential solo show. "There's something haunting about your work," he said, studying a photograph I'd taken of an abandoned pier at sunset. "Like you're capturing secrets." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was capturing secrets my own, hidden in plain sight. But success, even small success, came with visibility. And visibility, I was learning, was a double-edged sword for someone trying to disappear. When the Seattle Weekly ran a small feature about emerging artists to watch, complete with a photo of me standing next to my work, I felt that familiar chill of exposure. Somewhere, Mother was probably reading every art publication, scanning every photography website, looking for traces of the daughter who'd had the audacity to disappear from her carefully ordered world. The gallery show was scheduled for September, 3 months away. I should have been excited. It was everything I'd dreamed of but never dared to pursue as Emily Monroe. Instead, I found myself calculating escape routes, researching cities further north, closer to the Canadian border. The pattern was becoming clear every time I started to build something real. Mother's shadow would appear on the horizon, forcing me to run again. I was creating beautiful work and meaningful connections, but I was also living like a fugitive, always looking over my shoulder, always ready to burn everything down and start over. Late at night, in my Capitol Hill studio, I'd stare at my reflection in the window and wonder if this was what freedom looked like or if I'd simply traded one prison for another, larger one that I carried with me wherever I went. The girl in the reflection looked like Rachel Carter, but her eyes held Emily Monroe's fear, and I was beginning to understand that until I dealt with Margaret Monroe directly, those eyes would never change. The knock on my apartment door came at 8:45 on a Thursday evening in late August, 3 weeks before my gallery opening. I was editing photos on my laptop, lost in the meditative process of adjusting light and shadow, when the sound froze me in place. Nobody knocked on my door. The few friends I'd made in Seattle always texted first. My landlord had my phone number. Pizza delivery required buzzing up from the lobby. Through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive coat despite the summer warmth. But there was something familiar about the slope of his shoulders, the way he stood with his hands clasped behind his back. "Rachel," he called softly, or should I say Emily? My father's voice, older and more tentative than I remembered, but unmistakably Thomas Monroe. I opened the door with trembling hands, and for a moment we just stared at each other. He looked smaller than he had in my memories, more fragile, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of recent stress. "Dad." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, and the gentleness in his voice nearly broke me. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, watching him take in my modest studio, the photography equipment scattered across my desk, the prints hanging on the walls, the simple furniture I'd collected from thrift stores and yard sales. "You found me," I said, wrapping my arms around myself. "Is Mother—" "Your mother doesn't know I'm here," he said quickly. "I hired my own investigator. It took me months to track you down, and I made sure his findings stayed confidential." "Why?" The question hung between us like a challenge. He was quiet for a long moment, studying one of my photographs, a black and white image of a homeless woman feeding pigeons in Pioneer Square, her face illuminated by a shaft of afternoon light. "Because I left her," he said finally. 3 months after you disappeared, I couldn't live with what she said to you that night, what she'd been saying to you your whole life." The admission hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto my second-hand couch, struggling to process this information. "You left Mother." "I should have left years ago," he said, sitting carefully on the edge of my desk chair. "I should have protected you from her. I failed you as a father, Emily, and I'm sorry." Tears I'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. "I tried so hard to make her love me." "I know you did, and the failure was never yours, it was ours. Mine, for being too weak to stand up to her. Hers, for being incapable of seeing what a remarkable daughter she had." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "She's been telling people you're in Europe, studying art, living off a trust fund that doesn't exist. She's completely rewritten the narrative to make herself look like the generous mother supporting her artistic daughter's dreams." "Of course she has." The bitter laugh that escaped me sounded foreign to my own ears. "There's more," he said gently. "She hired that investigator who found you in Denver. When he reported back that you'd disappeared again, she became obsessed. She's convinced herself that you're mentally ill, that you're having some kind of breakdown that reflects poorly on her parenting.
She's not wrong about the breakdown part, I said weakly.
Emily!
His voice was firm now, more like the father I'd occasionally glimpsed during my childhood. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not mentally ill. You're not broken. You're a young woman who escaped an abusive situation and built a new life for herself. That takes incredible strength. He gestured toward my photographs covering the walls. Look what you've created. Look at the beauty you're capturing. Your mother sees this as evidence of your instability, but I see it as proof of your resilience.
She'll never stop looking for me, I said. She'll keep sending investigators, keep tracking me down.
Actually, that's why I'm here. He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. I want you to know that you have choices beyond running. I've been documenting her behavior since I left recording phone calls where she talks about you, gathering evidence of her attempts to track you down, building a case for harassment.
The envelope he'd brought contained copies of investigator reports, phone records, even transcripts of conversations where Mother detailed her plans to bring Emily home, whether I wanted to come or not.
She's also been accessing your old bank accounts, trying to track financial activity. It's probably illegal, but she has connections who've been helping her. I thought you should know.
Reading through the documents felt like watching a psychological thriller where I was somehow both the victim and the star. Mother's obsession with finding me had consumed her life. She'd joined private investigator forums online, contacted my college friends, even driven to Chicago to interview my former professors.
She can't accept that I chose to leave, I said, understanding finally hitting me. It doesn't fit her narrative about being the perfect mother.
Exactly. And that's why running will never be enough. She'll keep coming because your absence forces her to confront questions about herself she's not equipped to handle.
He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. But I also came here to tell you something else. You're not alone anymore. I know I failed you before, but I'm here now. If you want to keep running, I'll help you do it safely. If you want to face her, I'll stand with you. And if you want to build a legal wall between yourself and her harassment, I have the resources to make that happen.
The offer was overwhelming. For so many years, I'd felt like it was just me against Mother's relentless criticism. The idea that someone, especially my father, was finally willing to take my side felt almost too good to be true.
What does facing her look like? I asked. Cease and desist orders, restraining orders if necessary, public exposure of her behavior if it comes to that. He turned back to me, and I saw steel in his expression I'd never witnessed before. I have 40 years of documentation about what it's like to live with Margaret Monroe, medical records from when you were hospitalized for exhaustion in high school, teachers' reports about your anxiety, a paper trail that shows exactly who she is and what she's done. You kept records.
I told myself I was protecting you by staying, by documenting everything in case I ever found the courage to leave. But really, I was protecting myself keeping evidence so I could pretend I wasn't complicit in her abuse. The word hung in the air between us. Abuse. I'd been in therapy long enough to understand intellectually that Mother's treatment constituted emotional abuse, but hearing my father say it out loud made it real in a way it had never been before.
She's already damaged her reputation by the way she's been acting since you left, he continued. People are starting to ask questions about why her daughter would disappear so completely. Some of her friends have stopped taking her calls because she won't talk about anything else.
Good, I said, and was surprised by the venom in my own voice. The question is, what do you want to do with that you can keep hiding? And I'll support that choice. Or you can use the platform you're building here, your art, your gallery show to tell your story on your own terms.
I looked around my apartment, at the photographs that had become my voice, at the life I'd built as Rachel Carter. For the first time since leaving Cleveland, I felt like I had real options instead of just escape routes. I need time to think, I said. Of course. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Emily, I want you to know I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the person you've become, the art you're creating,
the courage it took to save yourself when no one else would. Your mother may never be able to see it, but you're extraordinary." After he left, I sat in my dimly lit apartment surrounded by photographs that told the story of my journey from captivity to freedom. And for the first time since that devastating birthday dinner, I began to imagine what it might feel like to stop running and start fighting back. The gallery opening for Behind Perfect Walls took place on a crisp September evening, exactly 10 months after I'd walked out of Lumiere Restaurant and into my new life. The Meridian Gallery buzzed with Seattle's art crowd collectors, critics, curious locals drawn by the mysterious R. Carter, whose haunting photographs had been generating whispers throughout the city. But I wasn't hiding behind initials anymore. The placard next to the entrance read, "Behind Perfect Walls, a photographic journey by Emily Monroe." Below it, in smaller text, an exploration of hidden truths, family secrets, and the courage to break free from beautiful cages. Each photograph told part of my story without revealing it directly. The image of the homeless woman feeding pigeons, a meditation on finding grace in abandonment. A child's ballet shoes, bloody and abandoned in a dressing room, the price of pursuing someone else's dreams. A perfect dining room set for dinner, but photographed through a cracked window, the violence that lurks beneath pristine surfaces. Marcus Williams had been hesitant when I'd insisted on using my real name, worried about the legal implications of what I was about to do, but I'd spent weeks with lawyers Dad had recommended, crafting an artist's statement that told my truth without crossing into libel. This exhibition explores the psychological landscape of a daughter raised by a narcissistic parent. The wall text read, "Each image represents a moment of recognition, the realization that love was being used as a weapon, that perfection was a prison, that sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear entirely." I'd also written a companion essay, published simultaneously in Seattle's alternative weekly, titled "The Art of Disappearing When Family Love Becomes Abuse." It was my first piece of writing under my real name since college, and every word had been carefully chosen, legally vetted, but emotionally true. The piece described growing up in Cleveland's elite social circles, the pressure to be perfect, the mother who saw her daughter as a reflection of her own worth rather than a separate human being. I wrote about birthday dinners that felt like trials, about the exhausting effort of trying to earn love that was perpetually withheld, about the moment I realized that disappearing might be the only way to save myself. I didn't name Mother directly, but anyone who knew the Monroe family would recognize the details. More importantly, anyone who'd lived through similar experiences would see themselves in my words. The gallery was packed by 7:30, but I found myself scanning the crowd nervously, half expecting to see Mother's silver hair and perfect posture cutting through the crowd like a blade. Dad had assured me she was still in Cleveland, but paranoia was a hard habit to break. Instead, I saw faces lit with recognition, women who nodded knowingly at certain photographs, men who stared too long at the image of a child's bedroom with its door firmly closed. My story was resonating because it wasn't just my story. It was the story of anyone who'd ever been made to feel like their worth depended on someone else's impossible standards. Grace had flown up from Denver for the opening, and seeing her familiar face in the crowd steadied my nerves. Jorge had sent flowers with a card that read, "Proud of you, mija, never stop creating." But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached me near the end of the evening. She couldn't have been more than 22, with short blonde hair and nervous energy that reminded me painfully of myself at that age. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly. "I read your essay online yesterday, and it helped me understand that I'm not crazy, that my mother's behavior isn't normal." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know yet, but knowing that someone else escaped gives me hope that maybe I can too." I pressed my card into her hand. "If you ever need to talk to someone who understands, call me." As the crowd thinned and the gallery staff began taking down the wine glasses, Marcus approached with news that felt surreal. "We've sold 12 pieces tonight," he said, grinning. "And I've had inquiries from galleries in Portland and San Francisco. Emily,
You've created something powerful here." The success felt different from anything I'd achieved as the perfect daughter trying to earn mother's approval. This success belonged entirely to me, built from my truth. My pain transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Dad appeared as I was packing up the last of my promotional materials. He'd stayed in the background during the opening, giving me space to own my moment, but I could see the pride shining in his eyes. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Terrified," I admitted, but also free, really free, for the first time in my life. He handed me his phone. "You might want to see this." The screen showed Mother's Facebook page, something I'd avoided looking at for months. Her latest post, dated 3 hours earlier, was a carefully crafted statement about family privacy and artistic expression taken too far. She'd positioned herself as the victim of a daughter's public breakdown, claiming that my mental health struggles had led to hurtful fabrications. But the comments told a different story. Her friends weren't rallying to support her as she'd expected. Instead, they were asking pointed questions, sharing their own stories of difficult family dynamics, expressing sympathy for the daughter who'd felt compelled to disappear. Eleanor Walsh, the mother whose daughter Mother had always held up as superior to me, had written, "Margaret, I've watched Emily grow up, and she was always a lovely, talented girl. Maybe it's time to ask yourself why she felt she needed to leave rather than blaming her for speaking her truth." "She's losing control of the narrative," Dad said softly. For the first time in her life, people are questioning Margaret Monroe's version of reality. That was exactly what I'd hoped for, not destruction, but exposure. Not revenge in the traditional sense, but the simple, radical act of telling the truth and letting others draw their own conclusions. 3 weeks later, I received a cease and desist letter from Mother's lawyers, demanding I stop defaming her through my so-called art. I forwarded it to my own attorney and continued planning my next exhibition. 6 months after Behind Perfect Walls, I was living openly as Emily Monroe again, no longer hiding behind assumed names or fake identities. I'd moved into a larger studio space where I could work and display my art, and I was teaching photography workshops for young people who needed creative outlets for their own difficult stories. Mother never stopped trying to control the narrative, but her voice was just one among many now. The art world had embraced my work, and more importantly, survivors of family abuse had found community through the conversations my exhibition started. I still missed the safety of being invisible sometimes, but I'd learned something crucial. The only way to be truly free from someone's control is to stop letting them dictate your choices, even the choice to hide. Margaret Monroe had wanted me to disappear from her life, and in a way, I had. But instead of vanishing into nothing, I disappeared into myself, the self I'd always been but had never been allowed to become. And from that authentic place, I'd built something beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what parts of this journey resonated with you. Please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about family, freedom, and finding the courage to live your truth. Your stories matter too.